I stood in the dusty, silent workshop, where the smell of oil and old wood still lingered, holding a heavy iron key that wasn't supposed to exist. My grandfather, Arthur, was a simple man, a watchmaker who lived by the ticking of clocks and strict routines. He died leaving me nothing but this house and a lifetime of gentle silence. But when I accidentally knocked loose a panel behind his workbench, I found the safe. It was cold, black steel, hidden away like a shameful sin. My hands trembled violently as I slid the key into the lock. I expected to find cash, maybe some gold. Instead, I found a stack of passports with his face but different names, and the adoption decree dated 3 days after I was born. That moment didn't just freeze my blood. It erased the only family history I ever knew. But to understand why the man I loved was actually a stranger, I need to go back. Before I go back to that cold afternoon in the workshop, tell me, where are you listening from? What city or country? The silence in the house was heavier than the furniture. It has been 7 days since the funeral, and the air still felt thick with the scent of lilies and the stale metallic odor of old brass that clung to everything my grandfather owned. Arthur was 82 when his heart finally gave out, stopping with the same sudden, quiet precision of a clock that had simply forgotten to be wound. Growing up, I didn't know much about the world outside this house. My mother had died when I was barely walking. A car accident, he had told me. Tragic and quick. And my father was a figure that never existed in our stories. It was just Arthur and me. He was a man of routines, a creature of habit so ingrained that you could set your watch by his movements. Coffee at 6 a.m., black, no sugar. Workshop at 7 a.m. Lunch at noon. He was a watchmaker, one of the last of his kind in our small town. People would bring him heirlooms, shattered mechanisms, and hopeless cases, and he would sit there for hours, his monocle pressed into his eye, his large, steady hands manipulating gears smaller than a grain of rice. He wasn't a man of words. He never told me bedtime stories about dragons or princesses. Instead, he taught me how friction worked. He taught me that if you force a gear, you strip the teeth. Patience, Clara, he would say, his voice a low rumble that vibrated through his chest when I sat on his lap. You can't rush time. You can only respect it. I loved him with a ferocity that scared me sometimes. He was my wall against the world. But looking back now, through the lens of grief and the silence of this empty house, I realized that the wall wasn't just to keep me safe. It was to keep the world out. There were oddities I ignored because children accept their reality as absolute truth. The way he never let me answer the phone. The way he triple-locked the front door every single night, checking the deadbolt until his knuckles turned white. We never traveled. We never had guests. If a car slowed down too much in front of our driveway, Arthur would freeze, his body going rigid, his eyes tracking the vehicle through the curtains until it disappeared around the bend. I used to think he was just grumpy, or perhaps just old and set in his ways. I thought it was the eccentricity of a genius who spent his life listening to the ticking of 1,000 clocks. The house was a fortress of solitude. He built a universe for us inside these walls, filled with the comforting rhythm of pendulums swinging back and forth. Tick, tock, tick, tock. It was a heartbeat that assured me everything was fine, everything was ordered, everything was under control. But now, with him gone, the clocks were winding down one by one. The silence was creeping in. And in that silence, I began to notice things I had chosen to ignore. The way he had no photos of his youth. The way he had no old friends who called to offer condolences. It was as if Arthur had materialized out of thin air the day I was born, fully formed, with no past and no history. I spent the first few days just wandering from room to room, touching his things, trying to feel his presence. I sat in his leather armchair, which still held the shape of his body. I smelled his old plaid shirts. I was drowning in the grief of losing the only parent I had ever known. I felt like a boat whose anchor had been cut, drifting into a dark, open ocean. I needed to feel close to him one last time. I needed to hear the sound of his work. So, on the 8th day, I forced myself to open the heavy oak door to his workshop. That's when something felt wrong. The workshop was usually a place of warmth, illuminated by the golden glow of his desk lamp. Now, In the gray afternoon light filtering through the dust-coated windows, it looked like a graveyard of mechanical parts. The air was cold. I walked to his workbench. It was exactly as he had left it. A disassembled pocket watch lay on a velvet pad, its tiny springs exposed like the organs of a small metallic animal. His tweezers were placed perfectly parallel to the edge of the table. Arthur was meticulous. He couldn't stand disorder. I ran my hand over the scarred wood of the bench, my fingers tracing the grooves worn down by decades of work. I sat on his stool, expecting to feel comfort, but instead, I felt a strange draft. A cold breeze was hitting my ankles. I frowned and looked down. The workshop was in the basement, half underground. There were no windows at floor level. I stood up and looked at the wall behind the workbench. It was covered in pegboard, hung with hundreds of tools, hammers, pliers, tiny screwdrivers, all organized by size. The draft seemed to be coming from behind the heavy wooden cabinet that stood against the far corner, where he kept his supplies of oil and cleaning solvents. I shouldn't have moved it. I should have just left it alone and gone upstairs to make tea. But grief makes you restless. It makes you look for meaning in the meaningless. I wanted to clean. I wanted to make the workshop perfect for him, even if he wasn't there to see it. I grabbed the side of the cabinet and pulled. It was incredibly heavy, filled with gallons of chemicals and metal scraps. I groaned, digging my heels into the concrete floor, and gave a massive shove. The cabinet screeched across the floor, scraping the cement with a sound that made my teeth ache. Behind it, the wall wasn't concrete. It was wood paneling, and the wood was different. Slightly lighter, less dusty than the rest of the room. My heart did a strange little flutter. Why would he panel just this small section of the wall behind a cabinet that was never moved? I stepped closer. The draft was stronger here. There was a seam in the wood, barely visible, disguised by the grain. I ran my fingernails along the seam. It was loose. "Grandpa?" I whispered, feeling foolish. The silence of the basement swallowed my voice. I pulled at the edge of the panel. It gave way with a groan of dry wood. It wasn't a wall. It was a door. A false back. My breath hitched in my throat. Arthur, the man who preached transparency, the man who said a watch only works if every gear is honest, had built a secret compartment in his own sanctuary. I pulled the panel completely off and set it aside. Behind it, carved into the earth and framed with brick, was a small, dark hollow. And sitting in that hollow, covered in a layer of gray dust that looked like velvet, was a safe. It wasn't a modern digital safe. It was an old, black iron beast with a heavy dial and gold lettering that had faded with time. It looked like something from a bank heist movie from the 1950s. It sat there, imposing and silent, radiating a sense of dread that made the hair on my arms stand up. Why? Why did a poor watchmaker need a safe this serious? We lived paycheck to paycheck sometimes. He clipped coupons. He fixed his own shoes with glue. If he had something valuable enough to require this much protection, why did we struggle? I reached out and touched the cold metal. It was locked, obviously. I tugged on the handle. It didn't budge. I stepped back, my mind racing. A secret safe, hidden behind a cabinet, hidden behind a false wall. This wasn't just about hiding money. This was about hiding something he didn't want anyone, especially me, to ever see. And then I found something I wasn't supposed to see. Resting on top of the safe, almost invisible in the shadows, was a small, rusted metal tin. An Altoids tin, decades old. I picked it up. It rattled. I opened it. Inside, there was no key. Just a single folded piece of paper and a small silver pin, a military insignia I didn't recognize. The paper was yellowed, brittle as a dried leaf. I unfolded it carefully. It was a receipt for a safe deposit box in a bank that had closed down 20 years ago, but scrawled on the back in Arthur's handwriting I knew better than my own, were 3 numbers, 14, 38, 09. The combination. I looked at the dial on the safe. I looked at the numbers. My stomach turned. I felt like an intruder in my own home. I felt like I was betraying him. He had hidden this for a reason. He had died keeping this secret. Who was I to strip him of it now? If stories like this matter to you, if you believe the truth deserves to be known even when it hurts, you're in the right place. I almost walked away. I almost put the panel back and dragged the cabinet into place and pretended I never saw it. But the question burned too hot. The mystery was a hook in my chest, pulling me forward. I knelt on the cold concrete. My hands were shaking so bad I could barely grip the dial. 14. Click. I spun it to the right. The mechanism grated, the sound of dry metal grinding against dry metal. It sounded like a bone breaking. 38. Click. To the left. The silence in the basement felt aggressive now. I felt watched. I looked over my shoulder, half expecting to see Arthur standing at the top of the stairs. Disappointment etched into his face. But there was only the dust motes dancing in the shaft of light. 09. Click. I held my breath. I grabbed the heavy iron handle and pushed down. Clunk. The sound echoed like a gunshot. The bolt retracted. The door groaned open, swinging heavy on its hinges. A smell hit me instantly. The smell of old paper, stale air, and something sharp, like gunpowder. The safe wasn't empty. The first thing I saw were stacks of cash. Bundles of bills, wrapped in rubber bands that had snapped with age. It looked like thousands of dollars, maybe hundreds of thousands. My mind reeled. We had eaten oatmeal for dinner for weeks when the roof leaked because we couldn't afford a contractor. He had fixed it himself, limping on his bad knee. All this time he had this? Anger flared in my chest. Hot, sudden anger. Why did he let us live like that if he had this? But then I saw the other things. Beneath the money, there was a leather satchel. I pulled it out. It was heavy. I undid the buckles and dumped the contents onto the floor. Passports. 5 of them. I picked up the first one. It was a British passport. I opened it. The photo was black and white, grainy. It was a young man with sharp eyes and a strong jaw. It was Arthur. There was no doubt. But the name printed next to the photo wasn't Arthur Miller. Name: Thomas Blackwood. Occupation: engineer. I dropped it and picked up the second one. A Canadian passport. Same photo, maybe a few years older. Name: Robert Halloway. The third one. French. Name: Jean-Luc Veron. I couldn't breathe. The room was spinning. My grandfather, the watchmaker, the man who never left his house, the man who was afraid of the doorbell. Who was he? He wasn't Arthur Miller. Arthur Miller was a fiction. A costume he wore. I dug deeper into the satchel. My hand brushed against something cold and hard metal. A gun. A small, snub-nosed revolver. Loaded. I pushed it away, terrified. At the bottom of the satchel, there was a manila envelope sealed with wax. On the front, written in red ink, was a single word. Clara. My name. He knew. He knew I would find this. Or maybe he hoped I never would. I was shaking so hard the envelope rattled in my hands. I tore the wax seal. I reached inside and pulled out a document. It wasn't a passport. It looked official, legal. It was a police report. A missing persons report from 32 years ago. Missing baby girl. Age 6 months. Status kidnapped. I froze. I was 32 years old. I scrambled to look at the date. The date on the report was 2 days before the birthday Arthur had always celebrated with me. I looked at the photo attached to the report. A baby. A baby with my eyes. And then I saw the name of the suspect listed on the bottom of the page. The man accused of taking the child. Suspect: Thomas Blackwood. That's when the truth started to surface. The paper felt like a razor blade in my hands. Suspect: Thomas Blackwood. I read the name over and over again, waiting for the letters to rearrange themselves, waiting for it to be a mistake, but the ink was indelible. I looked up at the passports scattered on the floor. Thomas Blackwood. The man in the British passport. The man with the sharp jaw and the cold eyes. My grandfather. My lungs felt tight, as if the oxygen had been sucked out of the basement. I forced myself to read the rest of the police report. The words blurred through the tears stinging my eyes. Date of incident: October 14th, 1992. Location: Chicago, Illinois. Victim: baby girl, Eleanor, 6 months old. Parents: Robert and Sarah Sterling. Deceased. Deceased. My heart hammered against my ribs. Thomas, had told me my parents died in a car accident. He said it was a rainy night. He said they skidded off a bridge. He had described the funeral, the closed caskets, the way I cried in his arms. But the police report told a different story. Cause of death, multiple gunshot wounds, home invasion, signs of struggle. The perpetrator, believed to be a contract specialist known only as the watchmaker, fled the scene with the infant. The watchmaker. I dropped the paper. I physically couldn't hold it anymore. It fluttered to the concrete floor, landing face up. The watchmaker. It wasn't a nickname for a hobbyist. It was a code name. I looked around the workshop. The gears, the springs, the pendulums, the obsession with time, the precision. It was all a joke. A sick, twisted joke he had played on me for 30 years. He wasn't a watchmaker who fixed clocks. He was a professional who fixed problems. I scrambled back from the safe, pushing myself across the floor with my heels until my back hit the leg of his workbench. I felt like vomiting. The man who taught me how to tie my shoes, the man who made me soup when I had the flu, the man who brushed my hair, he was a monster. He hadn't saved me from a car accident. He had stolen me from a crime scene. A crime scene he created. No, I whispered, my voice cracking. No, you wouldn't. You couldn't. But the safe was still open, vomiting its secrets. I needed to know the rest. I had to know. If I was Eleanor Sterling, if my parents were murdered, why was I here? Why was I alive? Why did he raise me instead of selling me or disposing of me? I crawled back to the pile of documents. My hands were numb. I reached for the manila envelope again. Behind the police report, there was a leather-bound notebook. A journal. It was old, the leather cracked and peeling. I opened it to the first page. The date was October 1992. The handwriting was sharp, jagged, different from the looping script I knew. This was Thomas writing, not Arthur. Entry, October 12, 1992. Job accepted. The Sterlings, high profile. The client wants a clean slate. No loose ends. The payment is routed through Zurich. Standard procedure. Entry, October 14th, 1992. It's done. Robert and Sarah are gone. It was messy. Robert had a gun. Unanticipated. But the job is compromised. I stopped reading. I squeezed my eyes shut, trying to block out the image of my grandfather, my grandpa, standing over my parents with that snub-nosed revolver I had just found. It's done, he wrote, like he had fixed a leak in the sink. I forced my eyes open. I had to read the next line. Entry, October 14th, 1992. Continued. I couldn't finish the checklist. There was an asset I didn't expect. The nursery. The baby. She was awake. She looked at me. She didn't cry. She just looked. The client was specific. No loose ends. That meant the child, too. I raised the weapon. I had the angle. I screamed. A short, sharp sound that died in the basement. I threw the notebook across the room. It hit the wall with a thud. He was going to kill me. He stood over my crib, looking at me, and he was going to pull the trigger. My entire life, every memory, every smile, every Christmas morning, was built on the foundation of a moment where a hitman decided not to shoot a baby in the face. I sat there in the silence, rocking back and forth, hugging my knees. I felt dirty. I felt complicit. I had loved a murderer. I had mourned him. I had cried at his funeral just a week ago, wishing he could come back. Now, I wished he was back just so I could scream at him. Just so I could ask him why. Why keep me? Guilt? A trophy? Did he keep me to remind himself that he still had a soul? Was I just a pet project to him? I looked at the notebook lying against the wall. It was open. The pages fluttered slightly in the draft from the secret door. I knew there was more. I knew that wasn't the end of the entry. I crawled over to it. I picked it up with 2 fingers, as if it were contaminated. Entry, October 15th, 1992. I took the asset. I couldn't leave her there. The police would hand her to the next of kin, and the next of kin is the client. If she stays in that world, she dies. If I leave her, she dies. If I take her, I'm a dead man walking. I have burned my bridges. I have burned my identity. Thomas Blackwood is dead. I am driving south. She needs milk. I don't know what babies drink. I need to figure this out. I stared at the words. The next of kin is the client. My head spun. Someone in my family, someone related to me, had hired him to kill my parents and to kill me. He didn't kidnap me for ransom. He didn't kidnap me to hurt me. He kidnapped me to stop the person who paid him from finishing the job. But who? Who hates a baby enough to hire a hitman? I dug back into the envelope. There had to be a name. There had to be proof. I found a photograph. It was a Polaroid, faded and yellow. It showed a man in a tuxedo, smiling, holding a champagne glass. He looked charming, handsome. He had the same eyes as me. On the back of the photo, Arthur had written, "The client, Uncle Julian, the man who wants everything, Uncle Julian, my father's brother." The revelation hit me like a physical blow. My own uncle had ordered the hit. He wanted the inheritance. He wanted the empire. And Arthur, Thomas, the hired gun, he had developed a conscience at the last second. But this didn't absolve him. He still pulled the trigger on my parents. He still killed them. He saved me, yes, but he orphaned me first. I felt a fracture in my soul. Two truths were fighting inside me. Truth 1, Arthur was my grandpa who loved me more than anything. Truth 2, Thomas was the man who murdered my mother and father. They were the same man. That's when the truth started to surface. But the worst part came later. I spent the next 3 hours sitting on that cold concrete floor, reading every single page of the 30 years of journals he had kept. The sun must have set outside, because the light from the window shaft faded to black, leaving me in the gloom of the single bulb hanging over the workbench. I was cold to my bones, but I couldn't move. The journals detailed the transformation, how Thomas Blackwood, the cold professional, slowly died, and how Arthur Miller, the gentle watchmaker, was born. He wrote about the first time I smiled at him. November 1992. She laughed today. A bubbling sound. It terrified me more than a loaded gun. I don't know how to protect something this fragile. He wrote about my first steps. June 1993. She walked. She fell, looked at me, and waited to see if I would help. I picked her up. She smells like talcum powder and trust. I don't deserve this trust. Every time she looks at me, I see her mother's eyes. I see Sarah pleading. He wrote about his nightmares. 1998. The dreams are back. I see the blood on the carpet. I wake up sweating, checking the locks. I check on Clara. She is sleeping safe. As long as she is safe, the ghosts can haunt me. It is the price I pay. I wept. I cried until my throat was raw. I cried for my parents, whom I never knew. I cried for the life I should have had. A life of wealth, family, maybe cousins and parties. But mostly I cried for the lie that was my life. I looked at the workbench, the tools I had played with as a child, the magnifying glass I used to burn ants on the sidewalk, and he had scolded me gently, saying, "Everything has a purpose, Clara, even the smallest ant. We do not destroy for fun." The irony was suffocating. The man who taught me to respect life had taken 2 lives for money. I felt a profound, crushing sense of isolation. I wasn't Clara Miller. Clara Miller didn't exist. I was a ghost, a stolen child hiding in a basement, protected by a murderer who was trying to repent. If you've ever lived something like this, if you've ever found out that the people you love aren't who they said they were, you're not alone. Some stories stay silent for years because the truth is too heavy to carry. I felt the weight of his sacrifice and the weight of his sin. They were inextricably linked. He gave up his life, his identity, his freedom, to raise me. He lived in fear every single day. The triple locks on the door, the fear of phone calls, the way he watched cars pass by. He wasn't paranoid. He was hunting for Uncle Julian. He was waiting for the past to catch up. He saved me, but he also stole me. I picked up the gun again. It was heavy. It was real. This was the instrument of my parents' death. I hated it. I wanted to smash it. I stood up, my legs cramping. I needed air. I needed to get out of this basement. I felt like the walls were closing in on me. I took the envelope, the journals, and the passports. I left the money. I didn't want his blood money. I walked up the stairs, my footsteps heavy. I went into the kitchen. The house was dark. I sat at the table where we had eaten thousands of breakfasts. I looked at his empty chair. I felt a sudden, terrifying urge to call the police, to turn it all in, to tell them, "Here, I found Eleanor Sterling. I am her. And the man who raised me was the killer." It would be justice. It would clear the cold case. It would expose Uncle Julian. But then, I remembered something. A specific entry from the journal, dated just 3 weeks ago, just days before he died. Entry: September 2023. I am tired. My heart is failing. I can feel the gears slipping. I have to leave everything for Clara. The safe, the truth. She needs to know. But I am afraid. Not of death. I am afraid that when she knows, she will hate me. And she has every right to. But I need to warn her. Julian is still out there. And he never stopped looking. I froze. He never stopped looking. I wasn't just reading history. I was reading a warning. I looked at the kitchen window. It was pitch black outside. But in the reflection of the glass, I saw something that made my blood turn to ice. A car was parked across the street. A black sedan. Engine running. Lights off. It had been there when I came home from the grocery store this morning. It was still there. Arthur, Thomas, had been the dam holding back the flood. And now the dam was gone. I looked down at the documents in my hand. There was one more piece of paper I hadn't looked at closely. It was clipped to the back of the folder. It was a bank account statement. Recent. Account name: Julian Sterling. Transaction: private investigator retainer. Note: locate asset Eleanor. High priority. My uncle hadn't given up. He knew Arthur was dead. He knew the protector was gone. I wasn't just grieving anymore. I was in danger. Then came the moment I will never forget. I stood in the dark kitchen, the refrigerator humming an oblivious, steady rhythm behind me, while my world collapsed. The black sedan across the street didn't move. It was a predator waiting for the right moment to strike. The engine exhaust puffed white clouds into the cold night air. I looked down at the documents in my hands, the evidence of a stolen life, a murder, and a 30-year-old lie. And then, I saw the final envelope. It was taped to the very bottom of the safe's interior, something I had missed in my initial frenzy. It was smaller, lighter. I ripped it open. Inside was a single key, a car key, and a note scrawled in shaky, desperate handwriting. It was dated the day before he died. Clara, if you are reading this, I ran out of time. I couldn't tell you myself. I was a coward until the end. But I am not a fool. I knew Julian would watch the obituary column. I knew he would come for you once I was gone. This safe isn't just a storage box. It's a dead man's switch. The moment my death certificate was filed, a digital notification was sent to a contact I kept from my old life. A lawyer in Zurich. He has the originals of everything you see here. The photos. The recordings of Julian ordering the hit. The bank transfers. He has instructions to release everything to the FBI 48 hours after my funeral. That is tonight, Clara. Midnight. I checked the clock on the microwave. 11:48 p.m. They are coming for you because they know the clock is ticking. They need to erase you before the files hit the federal database. You have 12 minutes. Take the gun. Go to the garage. Take the old Buick. I kept it fueled. Go to the police station. Do not stop for red lights. I love you. I am sorry, Grandpa. A loud car door slammed outside. My heart smashed against my ribs. I dropped the note. I grabbed the gun, the cold, heavy revolver that had killed my parents, and the folder of evidence. I heard heavy footsteps on the front porch, not the tentative knock of a neighbor. These were confident, heavy steps. Thump, thump, thump. The doorknob rattled. It was locked, of course. Arthur always triple-locked it. Then came the sound of glass shattering. The side window. "Clear the ground floor," a voice growled. Low. Professional. Terror, cold and sharp, flooded my veins. I couldn't make it to the garage. The garage door opener was loud. They would hear it. The hallway to the garage passed right by the living room where they were breaking in. I was trapped. I looked around the kitchen. The knives? Useless against hitmen. The back door? They would have someone covering the perimeter. I had only one place. I turned and ran back to the basement door. I opened it as quietly as I could, slipped inside, and locked it behind me. I practically fell down the wooden stairs, plunging back into the darkness of the workshop. I could hear them above me. Heavy boots on the hardwood floors. The sound of furniture being overturned. They were tearing the house apart. "Check the bedroom," someone shouted. I ran to the safe. The false panel was still removed. The heavy iron door was open. The safe, it was huge. It was built into the foundation. It was 5 feet tall. I scrambled inside the safe. It was a tight squeeze, smelling of old money and gun oil. I pulled the heavy iron door closed. I didn't lock it. I didn't know the combination to open it from the inside, but I engaged the heavy handle just enough to make it look flush. I sat there in the pitch black, my knees to my chest, clutching the gun with both hands. I heard the basement door upstairs being kicked open. Crack. "Basement," the voice said. "Go." Steps thundered down the stairs. Flashlight beams cut through the cracks around the safe door, slicing through the darkness of my hiding spot. "It's clear," a man said. "Just a workbench. Check the walls." The old man was a mechanic. "He has hides." I held my breath. I pressed my hand over my mouth to stop the sound of my own breathing. I could hear the blood rushing in my ears like a waterfall. Footsteps approached the workbench. I heard the scrape of metal. They were moving the tools. "Hey," a second voice said. "Look at this cabinet. There are scrape marks on the floor." My heart stopped. The cabinet I had moved. I hadn't pushed it back. "Move it," the first voice commanded. I heard the heavy screech of the cabinet being dragged away. Then, silence. "A false panel," the man whispered. I gripped the gun. I had never fired a gun in my life. Arthur had taught me to respect tools, but he forbade me from touching weapons. Now, I raised it, pointing it blindly at the crack in the door. The handle of the safe moved. Someone was turning the dial. 14, 38. They knew. They knew the combination. Julian must have found Arthur's old records. Or maybe he just knew Arthur that well. 09. The handle turned. The door groaned. Light flooded in, blinding me. A silhouette of a man stood there, holding a silenced pistol. "Found her," he said calmly into a radio on his shoulder. He raised his gun. I squeezed my eyes shut and pulled the trigger. Click. Nothing happened. No bang. No recoil. I opened my eyes in horror. The safety. I hadn't taken the safety off. The man smiled. It was a cold, professional smile. "It's over, Eleanor." He adjusted his aim. And then, a siren wailed. Not a distant siren. A wall of sound. Dozens of them. Screeching tires on the gravel driveway. Blue and red lights flashed violently, illuminating the basement through the high window wells. "Federal agents! Drop the weapon! We have the perimeter surrounded!" The voice on the megaphone shook the house. The man in front of me froze. He looked at the window, then back at me. "Boss," he said into his radio. "We have a situation." "Abort!" a voice screamed in his earpiece, loud enough for me to hear. "It's a setup! The feds are here!" The man cursed, holstered his weapon, and ran. He sprinted up the stairs. I didn't move. I stayed curled in the safe, shaking, the useless gun still in my hand. I heard shouting upstairs. "Get on the ground, now, police!" I heard glass breaking. A gunshot, loud, deafening, then shouting, then silence. Minutes passed, or maybe hours. "Eleanor Sterling?" a voice called out from the top of the stairs. "Clara Miller? Is anyone down there?" It wasn't a hitman's voice. It was authoritative, but human. "I'm here," I croaked. My voice was barely a whisper. "I'm in the safe." Footsteps came down. Gentle this time. An FBI agent in a windbreaker appeared in the doorway. He looked at me, cuddled inside a steel box, holding an antique revolver. He holstered his gun and held up his hands. "It's okay, ma'am. You're safe. We got the files. Your grandfather." He timed this perfectly. "We picked up Julian Sterling at the airport 10 minutes ago." I dropped the gun. It clattered on the steel floor. I crawled out of the safe, my legs weak as water. The agent offered me a hand. I took it. As I walked out of that basement, leaving the darkness behind, I looked back at the safe one last time. It was empty now. The secrets were out. The poison had been drawn. Arthur had been a killer. He had stolen me. He had lied to me every day of my life. But in the end, he had used his last breath to make sure the monster who wanted me dead would never touch me. The next few months were a blur of lawyers, depositions, and news vans parked on my lawn. The story was everywhere. The hitman and the heiress. They made it sound like a movie. They made Arthur sound like a dark hero. I hated the headlines. They didn't know him. They didn't know the way he hummed when he worked on a watch. They didn't know the way he carefully cut the crusts off my sandwiches. They only saw Thomas Blackwood, the assassin. I was the only one who remembered Arthur Miller. I inherited the Sterling estate. My uncle Julian is currently serving 3 consecutive life sentences. I sold his mansion. I sold his cars. I donated the money to charities for orphans and foster care. I didn't want a penny of the money that had put a price on my head. I kept the small house. I kept the workshop. One afternoon, about 6 months later, I was cleaning out the workbench. I was finally ready to pack up his tools. I picked up the old monocle he used to wear. I held it up to my eye, looking at the dusty room through his lens. The world looked distorted, magnified. You could see the cracks in things. I realized then that Arthur lived his whole life looking at the cracks. He saw the broken parts of the world, and for a long time, he was the one breaking them, but with me. He tried to fix something. He couldn't undo the past. He couldn't bring my parents back. The guilt of that would never leave him, and the pain of it will never fully leave me. I still wake up angry sometimes. I still cry for the mother I never knew, but I also remember the night I had a fever of 104, and he sat by my bed for 2 days, changing cool rags on my forehead, terrified to lose me. Love is a complicated mechanic. It doesn't always fit perfectly. Sometimes the gears grind. Sometimes the springs are rusted. I walked over to the safe. It was still open. I hadn't closed it since that night. I placed the monocle inside. Then I placed the journals. And finally, I took the photo of him holding me as a baby, the one where he looked terrified and hopeful all at once. I placed it on the metal shelf. I closed the heavy iron door. Spin right to 14. Spin left to 38. Spin right to 09. Clunk. It was locked. I wasn't locking the secrets away to hide them anymore. I was locking them away to rest. Stories like this exist because someone lived them, and someone listened. If you believe that even a broken clock can tell the right time at the end, then this story was for you. If you believe these stories deserve to be remembered, you're always welcome here. My name is Clara Miller, and this was the object he kept his whole life. Not the money, not the gun, but the secret that kept me alive.